Welcome back to segment 3 on chapter 1. We've talked so far about um, economics as a social science, why it's considered social and a science. We've talked about the benchmarks that set economics aside from anthropology, psychology, sociology, political science, those things, encompassing those concepts of opportunity cost, self-interest, or maximization, minimization, optimization, and also making decisions at the margin. And now we're going to talk about what the Economist Toolkit looks like. So if you or somebody wanted to be an economist, these are some of the things that not only you do on a daily basis, but this is kind of how you would go about doing it. And the Economist Toolkit actually starts out as an economist is trying to explain how the world works. And so they are developing and they're testing hypotheses to explain how the world works, how consumers make choice, how markets move, how to forecast, to estimate, to analyze, to develop predictive models that will make them not only successful, but to make the organizations that they work for or work with successful. And again, it's going to make these three assumptions, these three base assumptions. So these models are going to incorporate, again, the assumptions of opportunity cost, self-interest, and making choices at the margin. And the two main drivers of the economic models are going to be the variables that are incorporated into the model. And you've got a couple of different types of variables depending on whether they have the ability to change or not. And so if it's a variable, it's something that's value can change. If it's a constant, it's something that value doesn't change. Constant number of hours in a day, number of minutes in an hour. If you were I think the book talked about an individual trying to study the impact of certain vitamins. I think they talked about zinc on the common cold. So the common cold could be a variable in that it changes, its value can change. So the length of time in the common cold, that episode of care, it can change. It could be 2 or 3 days long. Some people, it's 2 or 3 weeks. So those values can change over time. And as we talked about, maybe it's in segment 2, we talked about economists, and when you're studying economics, again, it's a social science because it deals with people and their behaviors as they make choices. But it's also considered a science because they follow the scientific framework of the scientific model when they can. And so the scientific method, it's basically you develop a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis. If you reject your hypothesis, you go back to the drawing board and you see if there's a way that you can tweak your hypothesis to move it forward. And some economists get really frustrated if their hypothesis is rejected the first or second or third time out. But the thing they have to remember is they're getting additional data points. Those data points, each time it's rejected, that hypothesis will be able to take it back and reevaluate it, retweak it, redesign it in such a way that it would, more likely approximate reality, and they can go back through the testing process again. And as they talk about in the text, first you start out with a hypothesis. If you fail to reject the hypothesis, and the hypothesis is tested not only by you, but other people multiple times, and then nobody has the opportunity to reject the hypothesis, then it becomes a theory. Hypothesis, keep in mind it's the question that you're testing. It's been developed in your testing, the question or the approach or what you think should happen among variables. And then if it's tested enough times and nobody rejects it, or anybody doing research doesn't reject it, then it becomes a theory. The Big Bang Theory is an example. And if it's tested again over and over again and nobody rejects it, then it can become a law. The Economist law of demand, law of supply, they've been tested multiple times. Nobody has rejected the hypothesis. And because of that, it becomes a law. And also remember, when you're hypothesis testing, you have two options. You can either reject it or you can fail to reject it. You will never accept the hypothesis as proven or truth. And the reason that you don't accept it is because the world is so diverse and it's so complex and so many, combinations, permutations, that somewhere along the way, somebody could, at some point in time, come back and reject that hypothesis. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the hypothesis stage, the theory stage, or the law stage, one of those three stages that they go through, it can always be rejected. Somebody can come up with a set of data that's going to reject that hypothesis. And for that reason, you will never see anybody that says, I accepted the hypothesis as proven true, because it just doesn't happen, because you just don't go that route, because there is always that probability, no matter how small, that probability out there that somebody could find data points that would reject your hypothesis. Economists, because it is such a complex world, develop models. They develop models, they base them on assumptions, and they do this because the world is so complex and so diverse. They develop the models based on a set of assumptions because they try to simplify the world to a manageable degree so that they can manage all the interactions as they're going through their hypothesis testing and their model building and their model testing. You will get in, I think it's in chapter 2 or 3 of the text, you'll get into your first model, and it's going to be the production, possibilities model. And we'll talk about that in detail and, into some subsequent chapters, but that's probably the first model that you're going to see. And one way that economists try to control the environment, unfortunately, economists work in the real world. They're working with data that's being taken from real world experiences, and they unfortunately can't control the environment like if you were a biologist or a chemist working in the lab. You can test hypotheses, and it's easier to test them because you have somewhat more control over the environment that you're testing this in. Unfortunately, the economist doesn't. The economist is, working with data. The data can be flawed. It may not be the best data sets, but they take the data that they have access to and they develop these and test these hypotheses based on the information that they have in hand. And one thing, because they can't control the real world, and the real world is data driven, and at any one point in time, something can happen that skews your data set or turns your hypothesis upside down, is economists are known to invoke the assumption of ceteris paribus, which, as they say in the text, it's Latin for all other things equal or all other things changed. Economists had a lot of difficulty with hypothesis testing, and they pointed out in the book during COVID, because COVID it was an unexpected event that turned the world upside down, and it made it very difficult to continue hypothesis testing, and it was extremely difficult to manage and control all of those factors that were bombarding the models. But by invoking ceteris paribus, they can control that, and they can say with that the model was based on this and this and this data set, and all of the things equal or all of the things unchanged. One last thing we're gonna quickly touch on, and they talk about it in the book, fallacy of false cause. So when you're testing models, a lot of times you will have an independent variable and a dependent variable. Independent variable is a variable that induces or causes the change. The dependent variable is the variable that responds to the change. So as they set up the models, and let's say you're talking about linear regression, you're regressing a dependent variable on one or more independent variables. And that's the way that you're building that model. So as you set the models up, just remember your dependent variable is the one that responds to the change. The independent variable is the one that either causes or induces the change. And what happens is sometimes you want to be careful that if variables move in concert with each other, it may be because they are correlated. And the thing to remember is correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. And the example they have in the text, I think they talk about shorts and causing warm weather in the summer. And, just because people wear a lot of shorts and the weather's warm, they may be correlated, but, the shorts don't cause the warm weather in the summer. So you have to be extremely careful when you're doing economic analysis, and that you don't fall into this fallacy of false causation or fallacy of false cause, because when you have highly correlated values or highly correlated variables, it can tend to lead to that if you're not careful with your economic analysis or your model building and testing your hypothesis. And then the one last thing the text talks about positive statement. And a positive statement's a statement of fact or hypothesis. And compare that to a normative statement. It's a statement that makes a value judgment. Typically, people think of positive statements. The sky's blue, plants respond well to sunlight. In a normative statement, you're talking about a value judgment, and it more closely represents somebody's opinion or somebody's perception of how things should be. Maybe it's and you see it a lot among policymakers. They talk about developing policy based on what the world should be, or based on what the environment should be. So you want to just remember that positive statements and even the text talks about positive statements, what are going to be dealt with within the text that we're going to use for principles of microeconomics. And economists deal in positive statements. Typically, you see the normative statements, they're dealt with by policymakers, individuals working in government, because they have a perception or view of how the world should be, or how something should react, or how, if they develop and implement a policy, this should be the outcome. That's going to kind of wrap it up on section 3 of chapter 1. We've had the basis foundation built, and we'll start moving forward using the concepts that we talked about in chapter 1. We'll start moving forward in the subsequent chapters in the text. So until next time, thanks for joining, and we'll touch base soon. Thank you.